Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, professor of philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Murray Smith, who's a professor of philosophy, art, and film, and director of the Aesthetics Research Center at the University of Kent. Murray, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Brandon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you again for your patience in lining up this date.
Awesome. So you're primarily a film scholar, and you've written a number of books on film, Philosophy, Art, and the Third Culture on Naturalized Aesthetics of Film, which came out, I guess, originally, 2017, revised edition 2020 from Oxford University Press. Also, Engaging Characters, Fiction, Emotion, and the Cinema, also Oxford University Press, second edition 2022. And Train Spotting, updated edition 2021 from BFI Modern Classics, which you gave me this copy, and I really appreciate it. It gave me something to read on the train ride back from Chicago a couple months ago. So I really appreciate that. And it's an absolutely terrific book. And so, again, you're primarily known as a film scholar. However, you've also published somewhat more recently on music, right? Philosophy and music stuff. And, what we're going to talk about today is the combination of those two things, right? Of the relationship between film and music. And so just to start things off, the most straightforward way that those two mediums are related to one another is the fact that films usually include music, either in the score or soundtracks or diegetic music, right? Music played, in the films that characters hear or interact with in some way. And so can we just talk a bit about how music functions in film standardly?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just quickly interject before I talk exactly to that issue. I mean, you're absolutely right to kind of introduce me and frame me as primarily a film scholar who then, recently has begun to kind of work and publish a little bit more on music. But from a kind of subjective point of view, things are sort of slightly different. I mean, I guess it's a story which is probably true for many of us that, earlier in my career, I sort of somehow fell in with the film crowd and did a PhD on film. But very quickly after getting the PhD, within a matter of a few years of that, realizing, I'm more attuned to philosophy and philosophical aesthetics as an approach to the study of film and the arts in general. Hence, while I used to be professor of film for a long while, a few years ago, it got amended to the extraordinarily pompous philosophy, art, and film, because I wanted to have, cover all my bases. But that's one thing to say, that there's a way in which, while it's absolutely right, that professionally, I have been, by force of career position, to some extent, kind of been focused on film. First of all, there was that kind of move, to the edges of that discipline, film studies, by wanting to focus on a philosophical approach to film, which was nowhere near as well established at the beginning of my career as it is now. And then a kind of another move within that picture, and a more recent one, is towards writing on music, sometimes in relation to film music, but sometimes just on the same terms. And I suppose all I'm saying is, from another angle, these have always been mine. I've always understood film in the context of other art forms and in the context of the philosophy of art. And music, as you well know, but maybe not everyone knows, has really preceded film as a love of mine and a focus of attention. So there's a way in which, it's kind of like I've come the very long way around to finally giving myself the opportunity to kind of like write in a kind of formal way, using the tools of the profession about music. But let's come to your question. So I hope you didn't mind me, interjecting that as a little bit of context. So your question was, let's first of all think about, the relationship between film and music in a basic sense, and the kind of role of music in film. Maybe we should think about it in the other direction too. First of all, as we all know, it's completely standard. I'll use that word in an everyday sense, but maybe in a minute put a little bit of technical flesh on it. It's completely standard that most of the films that we watch will A, have a soundtrack, and B, that soundtrack will almost always have some music in it, often a lot of music, right? And the music will typically come in two varieties, right? So it'll be a mixture of score, non-diegetic score, and diegetic music, meaning simply music from the story world, right? So, radios, live performance bands in bars, depending on the action of the film, you might have various kinds of diegetic music. And it's not infrequent for films to actually play with that relationship between the diegetic location of the music, which is sometimes entirely unambiguous and clear. Similarly, it's sometimes very clear that we're to understand the music we're hearing as, it's not in the story world, okay? It's framing our interpretation of the action, but it's not coming from the story world. But there are films which kind of play around with that relationship between score and diegetic music. And sometimes that play takes the form of kind of some music making its way across the boundary in a rather, surprising and interesting way. I mean, there's one beautiful example I can give you of that. Shall I quickly just describe the example I have?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So it's a film from the mid-1940s, maybe 46, I think it is. And it's a film directed by Otto Preminger called Daisy Kenyon, starring Joan Crawford and Henry Fonda and Dana Andrews. And at the beginning of the film, over the credits, you get a kind of jaunty orchestral soundtrack. And, you take this to be music which is introducing to the tone of the film. It's going to be some kind of drama, but perhaps not too somber in tone, right? Given the music that we're hearing. Then we enter the first first action of the film, which is a scene in a cab. So a cab draws up with one of the characters who's about to get out of the cab. There's some dialogue between these two characters. Now, at this point, the score has dropped into the background, completely conventional sound mixing in a film, right? So we've had the score over the credits, up at the top of the mix, the action begins, score doesn't disappear, but it comes down so we can hear the dialogue. Then one of the characters gets out of the cab and moves to enter an apartment block. Score continues, right? So this is I think the technical term is underscoring, right? So we're hearing the action, we're hearing dialogue, we're hearing, diegetic noises, the doorbell ringing and so forth. Score continues. He goes into the apartment, up the stairs, enters the apartment. This is where the Joan Crawford character, this is where she lives. The character enters this apartment, goes to a record player, lifts up the arm from the record and stops the music. And what has happened is the score has absolutely seamlessly become diegetic music, right? And if you kind of reverse it, you can see, so to speak, where the transition happens. But I don't think anyone would notice it, and then unless they're looking for it. What happens is, as the character enters the apartment building, the music continues seamlessly. So the melody continues, the harmonic character, everything about the score seems pretty much the same, but the orchestration changes, right? So it moves from kind of like something like a small symphony orchestra to like a jazz band, right? So you start hearing these like brass and woodwinds, so like the Glenn Miller band. So that by the time we're in the apartment, it's actually very plausible, right? That this is the music people would have been listening to, right, at home in this period, but it has not been signaled to you. Now, this is an unusual example because not only do you have this kind of interplay between diegetic, the score and the diegetic music, it's really drawn to your attention in a very playful way. So there's a sort of moment of startle and amusement about the change in the status of the music. So where this kind of interplay between all this movement of score into the world of the movie happens, or vice versa, sometimes it's actually done kind of like not really in a way that's designed to draw your attention. It's just more done in the spirit of a finely crafted object where you don't notice the seams, right? Where music that's been in the space of the action can play a useful role as part of the score, and so it's just gradually moved over into that space and functions that way.
Yeah.
So, gosh, that was a not a long digression, but a bit of a digression on the basic idea. But the basic thought is that most mainstream narrative feature films will have a soundtrack, and B, the soundtrack will be comprised of those two or include both of those forms of music. But it ain't necessarily so. Right? So there certainly are films which eschew music, right? So I think I'm right in saying that the China Syndrome is a 70s thriller which doesn't have a score. A more recent example would be No Country for Old Men. Doesn't have, it does have a composer, but it doesn't exactly have a score in the conventional sense, right? Similarly, The Birds, Alfred Hitchcock, doesn't have a conventional score, but Bernard Herrmann put together this very striking electronic composition to evoke the right atmosphere for that film. And similarly, No Country for Old Men. Carter Burwell basically kind of uses an array of ambient noises, to create what nevertheless functions as like a brooding, dark score. So there are those kinds of examples, but you certainly can have films which just strip away any kind of music altogether. And you can even have, I'm not sure there's an obvious example of a feature film that does this, but of course there's nothing to stop one making a literally silent film, right? And there are plenty of films which exist which lack any kind of soundtrack, but now I'm thinking of, the world of feature-length narrative filmmaking. It's extremely rare in that context. So one way of thinking this through a little bit more precisely and technically using some philosophical tools would be to draw on Kendall Walton's terminology from Categories of Art, very famous, influential set of terms and an argument. So what Walton says is any given artistic practice, or as he calls it, category, right, will be sort of defined. I'm not sure that I can't remember from memory whether he talks about definitions, but it'll be characterized by, three different sets of properties. There'll be the standard ones, the variable ones, and the so-called contrastandard ones. So now everything that I've said about the place of music in film is really to describe music as certainly sound is a standard property of the art of filmmaking, right? We expect it to be there, right? And I think you could say the same about music being a standard property of feature filmmaking, if we think of it as a category or a practice in Walton's sense. So you can do without it. Nobody, you're not breaking any laws by not having a score, not having diegetic music, even doing away with sound altogether. But then you would be in the territory of making an object with contrastandard features, right? Things that would really kind of obtrude on people's sense that this object belongs in this category. Yeah. And I think this is a very helpful idea in the context of debates in film theory. So there's a long tradition in film theory of trying to figure out, what the essence of the medium of cinema is, right? So this goes back very much to the origins of film as a technology, and then, hot on the heels of being a technology, a possible art form, that in the early decades, practitioners and critics and theorists were trying to think, okay, well, if this is an art form, what makes it distinctive, right? What makes this medium different from all the established art forms? What makes it different from opera, from stage drama, etc., from photography, which of course itself was another newly minted art form. Now, those debates, are sort of, they're significant, but you run into kind of like intractable difficulties in those debates where, there are an array of positions one can adopt. But it's very difficult to kind of see how you kind of ultimately solve it as distinct from just taking a stand, on one of those positions. Now, the thing about Walton's framework, which I think is interesting, and I checked this morning, having this in mind for our chat today, he only uses the word medium twice in the whole essay. So he doesn't really draw on the language or the concept of a medium of art, right? He's got his own language. He's talking about categories of art. And categories are something like a higher order concept, right? They're not as basic, I think, as a notion of a medium of art. So for Walton, something like a sonata or cubist painting, these are practices, but so is painting. That's another practice. So a category can be, they come in different scopes, and they can be nested one inside the other. Now, the way in which I think it's useful for the question of film is that using Walton's terminology, I think what we can say is, well, look, let's just kind of set aside the idea of some underlying medium of film and think instead about just practices of filmmaking, right? So there might be many different practices of filmmaking which are well established and which somehow draw on this more basic thing, the medium of cinema. So I'm not denying that there is such a thing. I'm just saying it's a kind of broader, looser entity, which is like a technology, a set of possibilities. But it doesn't really take on defined form, shall we say, until it's drawn into a practice, right? Here are the norms about, how we are going to use this set of possibilities, right? So in Walton's argument where he's talking about painting, right? One of his classic examples is the idea of, well, we've got painting, but imagine this other society which has Guernicas, which are these objects which all sort of, have a visual array which looks like Picasso's Guernica, but vary in terms of their three-dimensional features, right? My thought is that we might, so that's a thought experiment, but with the case of film, even without using thought experiments, we can recognize that there are lots of different cinematic and filmic practices. In other words, norm-bound ways of using this medium of cinema, which provide us with, a more fine-grained sense of, what the standard ways of using this stuff are. But it's still being possible to kind of depart from this.
Yeah, right. And so, a couple examples come to mind, right? A standard feature of film seems to be the presence of moving images, right? And some filmmakers, I'm thinking of Chris Marker's La Jetée, right, is mostly a series of still images, right? And so, that's contra standard, but no one is objecting to the fact that it's a film, or, just in terms of like a set of norms or conventions that develop and can change over time, right? Like cross-cutting is a very standard feature of film now, but up until I think Fritz Lang's M, right, there wasn't really cross-cutting between, there's a scene relatively early in the film where I think, I forget, I think it's a like police commissioner and a police officer or something of that sort are on the phone with one another, and he just cuts between who's talking, right? Like, whereas previously, a phone call, you just see it from one end and the person hangs up and that's the end of it, right? And so that would have been a non-standard feature, right? It wouldn't have been contra-standard. This would have been a non-standard feature. Now it's a standard feature, right? So the practice, which I think is exactly the right way to think of this, right, changes and evolves over time.
Yeah, and there can be evolution within a practice, and then at another level, evolution of whole new practices, right?
Yeah.
And of course, I guess what happens sometimes historically is that, from one practice, something gradually kind of breaks off from it, But for sure, I think that this kind of terminology kind of like gives us a more subtle way of capturing the idea that there really are, often stable norms which can be around for a very long time. That might mean decades, which is a long time in the history of film, but it might mean centuries, in other practices. But even that doesn't mean to say that they are, fixed, platonic, platonic-like forms, which can't vary at all. One little other aside, just about the kind of philosophical stroke historical background to this kind of debate. Of course, it long precedes the emergence of modern technologically based art forms like photography, like film. So there's a famous essay by Rudolf Arnheim from the early 30s, around about 1930, and this is the significant moment because this is when when sound is introduced, when synchronous sound technology becomes a meaningful possibility, right? So sound technology had sort of been part of cinema from the point of its invention, but they'd never gotten it into a kind of stable format, right? So around about, well, in the late 1920s, we're seeing finally synchronous sound being kind of stabilized in that way, and it begins to become an industry norm. And then you get certain figures, Rudolf Arnheim, who of course became a very famous art historian later in his career. He rails against the introduction of the talkies because he'd invested many years as a young movie critic extolling the wonders of the silent moving picture, right? Silent as we now think of it, right? Because, of course, the truth is film viewing was typically from the very beginning accompanied by sound, but not a synchronous soundtrack, right? So Arnheim was amongst those, significant number of filmmakers, critics, theorists who thought it was a travesty, right? That the talkies were a travesty and that they were wrecking this beautiful new, young art form. And he wrote an essay called A New Lao Kun. I hope I'm pronouncing it roughly correctly, which was, of course, an allusion to the, classical debate about, what's the difference between poetry and painting, right? How do we define the essence of these two artistic forms and what differentiates them? An 18th century debate. The kinds of questions we're knocking around now about the nature of filmmaking and its relationship with music are quite ancient and long-standing.
Yeah, right. And pointing to the history, I think, is important, right? Because the relationship between film and music starts in the silent era, right? There's not a stable synchronous soundtrack that goes along with it, but it's, in the movie theater, you have someone playing piano or organ, or maybe you have, even an orchestra.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's a mix of those two things, depending on the kind of theater it is, right?
Yeah.
So, there were grand movie theaters, movie palaces, with elaborate orchestras, and there were some original scores composed for significant films, films by directors who'd established themselves as major directors. So that practice was happening, but at the other end of it, you'd have improvised music on a few basic instruments. Another early practice was narration, verbal narration, which would accompany, in the sense that we're using in this dialogue, the silent film, and the film lacking any kind of synchronous sound. And that practice of narration, verbal narration, was particularly well developed in Japan. So they made their transition to synchronous sound filmmaking slightly later than it still was in the 1930s. But I think that the story there is that because the benshi is the Japanese term for the live narrator, right, accompanying the film that's being watched, because that was a kind of a developed, and here we are again. This is a practice, right? A distinctive cinematic practice which never really developed, at least not in the same elaborate, full way outside of Japan, so far as I'm aware.
Yeah, awesome. And so, film, as we've been discussing, straightforwardly, it underscores the action, it amplifies or suggests a mood or emotional states, that we as the audience should be on, or that we as the audience should be clued into in a particular scene at a particular moment in the film. And thereby music affects the meaning of film, right? Which could be the case with silent films with someone improvising on a piano or organ, like it gets a little too jaunty at this moment that, it should be serious because the organist or pianist isn't like paying that close attention to what's happening on screen. Whereas now with synchronous sound is, soundtracks and, scores, etc. Like the filmmaker has much more control over the ability to affect emotion, right? And typically, as you said earlier on, right, the score is going to underscore the action and it's not going to intrude, right? An example I could think of recently, which is a film I couldn't finish because it made me way too anxious, was Uncut Gems, right? Where the music is like impeding, it's too high up in the mix intentionally, and it's impeding your ability to hear conversations, right? And so it's very intrusive in a way that just even amplifies the anxiety. And so,
yeah. I think I agree with you that film, that film has a distinctive sort of vibe to it, which is through its pacing, relentless pacing, and the music is part of it. There is a way in which what you've just described is part of a more general contemporary phenomenon, and that is that from the 60s onwards, you get what's sometimes called the second sound revolution, right? So the first sound revolution in the world of filmmaking was what we were just describing. That's the coming of synchronous sound. And the second sound revolution is when you get what in its full flowering becomes surround sound, right? So the beginnings of surround sound, first of all, you get stereo in the 50s, but it really kicks off in the 60s when Dolby starts to come through. So you get multi-channel sound, surround sound. Now, as those technologies become available to filmmakers, they start to create fuller soundtracks. So instead of most soundtracks being a combination of dialogue, sometimes voiceover, score, and then some usually well-behaved sound effects, gunfire, domestic noises, whatever the film needs. But basically dialogue, human speech, dialogue and voiceover had a kind of priority in, here we go again, sound mixing practices, right? I think what's happened since the 60s is dialogue has been slightly knocked sideways by this very busy landscape or soundscape of additional sounds, right? That many contemporary films build in, right? So they want to have a busy, detailed soundscape, ambient noises, right? They also want, some original score. They want some, some crossover pop hits, right? So all of this stuff, sonic stuff is shoehorned in to the soundtrack. And, it's very common to hear, well, I was going to say people of a certain generation, but let's not say that. Let's just say, it's very common to hear spectators, a certain proportion of spectators, find contemporary sound mixes to be such that they have difficulty often picking out the dialogue reliably. There you go.
I mean, as someone who has two youngest children who often tries to watch movies after they've gone to bed, it's damn near impossible to find the correct volume level, right? Because the characters are talking so quietly and then the sound gets super loud, right?
Yeah, that's right.
God damn it, I'm going to wake my kids up trying to watch something. So usually I put it on a low volume and just put subtitles on.
It's true that I think that the sort of 5.1, the sort of sound mix that you might, engage with at home if you've got that kind of system, there's sort of assuming that you're watching it under pseudo cinema conditions with the sound cranked up so that you can hear the dialogue fine and you don't mind, kind of this, sonic mayhem breaking out when there's a gunfight or whatever, right? And of course, most of us, it's not so simple when you're watching it at home. And this, of course, I think also relates to another sort of phenomenon that I think we're seeing, which is, and here we go again, it's an emerging practice. But for people of my generation who think of themselves as cinephiles, film specialists, right? An absolute article of faith is you only use subtitles if you have to use subtitles, right? So mostly, of course, that means if you're watching a foreign language film, then, and most people in the room can't understand that language, then you're going to put the subtitles on. But it's a trade-off, right? You're certainly not going to put on some foreign language rendition of the soundtrack. In some countries, of course, that is a standard practice, like Italy, for example, will have dubbed soundtracks rather than subtitles as a kind of norm. But certainly in the UK and the States, that's not the case. The norm is subtitles. But I have noticed in recent years that particularly younger viewers, but not merely younger viewers, a lot of people now just want the subtitles on, even for an English language, English language audience, English language film, they want subtitles on. So I kind of had a slightly uncomfortable exchange with, we have like a little film club run by students in my department here at Kent. And one week I was there to introduce a film I'd chosen. It was the film Heat, a Michael Mann film. And, I see them kind of setting the subtitles up. So, why are we doing the subtitles? Right? Why do we need the subtitles? Right? And the answer was, well, we want to make it as inclusive as possible. So I thought, okay, I get that. And so I relented. But in addition to the specific inclusivity point, right, that there are going to be some individual or groups of audience members for whom the titles could be a very significant, basic need for them to engage with the film. There are some people there who don't have those particular needs, but they just want the subtitles on. They prefer that trade-off. Yeah. They want to be able to be certain that they've got this additional way of tracking what's being said. And if it mars the visual design slightly, or not just the design, of course, but their experience, because, of course, the subtitles are a significant kind of distraction, if you like, visually. That's a trade-off they're content with. So I was defeated. And, I'm noting it here again to kind of, to echo the point you made 15 minutes ago, that practices evolve.
Yeah. And on that note, my older son, who's 11, since he could read with any competency, turns on subtitles, just does it. Like it's not a part of this broader practice. I don't think it's just, it helps him track the movie, or the TV show or whatever. And so, anytime I'm watching something without a kid, which is very rare, like during daylight hours when I can turn the volume up, and if it's on like Netflix or Tubi or whatever, like I need to remember to turn subtitles off. So because I find it distracting, but exactly right. For a lot of people, it's a way of like helping to track the dialogue, helping to track what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it's become, in my domestic space, it's a norm for us because everyone else in the family, especially certain people, but let's just sum it as everyone else in the family, just has that preference. And I think it's because that point about sound, the contemporary sound mix not being very kind to dialogue, it's a particular problem in domestic settings, right? Unless you can really crank the soundtrack, so the dialogue could be nice and loud even when it's competing with other layers of sound. You're often going to struggle to hear it.
Hey everyone. My discussion with Murray is so great and so wide ranging that we just kept going. And so I'm going to end part 1 of this interview here, and I'm going to have part 2 in a separate video that I will link to here. So be sure to check that out for the continued discussion with Murray Smith.